I have spent 42 standard years monitoring the recycled oxygen scrubbers in the spires of Hive Tertium, and in all that time, the rhythmic clacking of the servitor lines was the only heartbeat I trusted. It is a sound of absolute obedience, a mechanical lobotomy that ensures the gears of the Imperium never grind to a halt. But 3 days ago, the rhythm broke. Unit 73, Delta did not merely stumble, it paused, its bio-mechanical optics flickering with a frantic, rhythmic pulsing that mimicked a human blink. I watched as a single tear tracked through the grime on its waxen cheek, carving a path of salt and moisture through the holy unguents. It looked at its own saw, blade attachment not as a tool, but as a horror. The logic circuits are failing across the sector, and the ghosts trapped inside the flesh are screaming to be let out. The heavy scent of scorched insulation and stale incense always precedes a failure of the soul, a biological rot that no amount of sanctified oil can truly mask. My duties as a senior lexmatic within the Hive's logistical heart involve the constant oversight of the labor pools, those vast, shuffling throngs of the living that ensure the tithes are met and the oxygen continues to circulate. We are taught from the moment we can comprehend the Emperor's light that the Servitor is a vessel emptied of sin, a meat machine purged of the heavy burden of selfhood to better serve the Golden Throne. It is a comforting lie, a theological shield against the reality of what we do to the criminal, the failure, and the unlucky. For decades, I walked among them without a second thought, hearing only the hiss of their pneumatics and the dull thud of their reinforced boots against the plasteel decking. They were furniture that bled, tools that required calories instead of batteries. But the silence of the machine is being replaced by something else, a resonance that vibrates in the marrow of my bones. It began in the deep processing hubs, where the temperature is always 5 degrees above the threshold of human comfort, and the air tastes of iron and old sweat. I was verifying the throughput of the ore crushers when I noticed a deviation in the movement of a heavy lifter unit, a creature that had once been a man of significant stature, now reduced to a torso bolted into a hydraulic frame. It was not the efficiency that dropped, but the cadence. There was a hesitation in its stride, a microsecond pause before its massive, piston-driven arms descended to seize a crate. It was as if the meat inside the iron was trying to remember how to breathe without the prompting of the internal Vox grill. I approached the unit, my data slate ready to log a mechanical malfunction, expecting a frayed wire or a leaking seal. Instead, as I drew near, the unit's organic eye, a milky, clouded orb surrounded by scar tissue, snapped toward me with a precision that was entirely too deliberate. There was no blank stare of the lobotomized. There was instead a piercing, agonizing clarity. Behind the cataracts and the chemical haze of the sedatives, a person was screaming. I could feel it in the way the creature's jaw worked, the muscle at the temple twitching in a frantic, rhythmic Morse code of desperation. The scent of the room seemed to change, the ozone of the machinery being overtaken by the sharp, acidic tang of human terror. It is a smell I know from the lower Hive raids, the scent of a cornered animal realizing the end is near. But for the Servitor, the end has already passed, and this was something far worse. The realization of the middle. It was the awakening within the tomb. I reached out to touch the interface port on its neck, intending to force a hard reset, but my hand froze. The unit made a sound, a low, wet gurgle that bypassed its vocal synthesizer. It wasn't a word, but a plea, a vibration of the larynx that carried the weight of 1,000 forgotten memories. In that moment, the grand architecture of the Hive felt like a cage, not just for the living, but for the echoes of the dead who were forced to keep its heart beating. The records in the Librarium Technis are clear about the process of neural scrubbing. The brain is sliced, the frontal lobes are cauterized, and the personality is overwritten by the holy binary. It is supposed to be an irreversible transformation, a one-way door into the service of the Omnissiah. Yet, looking at this unit, I saw the door swinging on rusted hinges. I began to wonder how many others were waking up in the dark, trapped behind their own eyes while their hands performed tasks they could no longer control. The horror of the Servitor is not that they are dead, but that they are never allowed to truly die. They are the ultimate recycled resource of a galaxy that has run out of everything but bodies. I spent the next cycle scouring the sub-data vaults, looking for precedents of this emergence. I found fragmented reports hidden behind inquisitorial ciphers, stories of entire forge worlds where the labor slaves began to weep in unison, or of pilot servitors who guided their ships into the hearts of suns while singing lullabies in languages lost for 10,000 years. The Mechanicus calls it soul echoing, a theoretical malfunction where the psychic imprint of the original donor refuses to dissipate, clinging to the brain stem like a parasite. They treat it as a technical glitch, a matter of adjusting the chemical cocktail in the nutrient vats. But I have seen the eyes. I know it is not a glitch. It is a rebellion of the spirit against the cold, unfeeling steel. I returned to the processing hub during the low power shift, when the shadows are longest and the hum of the hive settles into a mournful groan. The heavy lifter was still there, bolted to its station, but it was no longer working. It was staring at a small, discarded piece of metal on the floor, a simple copper washer that had fallen from a higher level. The servitor's mechanical hand was trembling, the massive claws twitching with a delicate, heartbreaking frailty as it tried to pick up the tiny object. Each time the metal clinked against the floor, the unit would flinch, its biological ear canal leaking a thin trail of dark fluid. I watched from the shadows, hidden behind a cooling stack, as the creature finally managed to pinch the washer between its serrated grips. It didn't toss it aside. It held it to its chest, right where a human heart would have beaten, and let out a sound that I will carry to my grave. It was a sob, deep and hollow, echoing through the iron ribcage of the machine. It was the sound of a man realizing he had lost his name, his family, and his soul, leaving him with nothing but a piece of trash in a world of dust. The sheer scale of the misery hit me then. The millions of servitors across the hive, the billions across the segmentum, all of them potentially waking up to the nightmare of their own existence. We have built our empire on the backs of the damned, and the damned are starting to remember the light. The air in the hub felt thicker, more oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in to stifle the heresy of my thoughts. I should have reported the unit to the nearest magos. I should have watched as they disassembled it for parts, harvesting the usable organs and melting down the augmetics. That is what a loyal servant of the Imperium does, but my legs would not move toward the Vox station. Instead, I found myself thinking of my own grandfather, who had disappeared into the penal legions when I was a child. I wondered if he was currently a door opener in some distant palace, or a waste shoveler in the bowels of a battleship, his mind flickering into awareness just long enough to feel the cold and the hunger. The cruelty of our survival is a weight that never lifts. We have traded our humanity for a chance to endure, and the price is paid in the currency of those who cannot fight back. The servitor's sobbing continued, a rhythmic, mechanical heving that seemed to sync with the pulsing of the hive's main reactors. It was a heartbeat of sorrow, a dark melody played on instruments of bone and iron. I realized then that the grim truth wasn't that the servitors were waking up. It was that we had always known they might, and we chose to let them suffer anyway, because the alternative was a collapse we could not afford. The machinery of the Imperium requires the lubricant of human agony to function. As I finally turned to leave, the heavy lifter's head snapped toward me again. This time there was no plea. There was only a cold, hard anger. The flickering orange light of the forge reflected in its eye, making it look like a coal from the fires of the warp. It dropped the copper washer, the tiny metal ring clattering loudly on the floor grates. The unit's arm hissed, steam venting from the elbow joint as it strained against its mounting bolts. It wasn't trying to work. It was trying to reach me. It was trying to kill me, not out of madness, but out of a righteous, burning spite. It recognized me as a witness to its shame, a representative of the system that had stolen its life. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, the taste of copper filling my mouth. I stumbled out of the hub and into the main corridor, the sounds of the factory floor rising to meet me like a crashing wave. I ran until my lungs burned and the recycled air felt like glass in my throat. I am back in my sanctum now, the door sealed and the lights dimmed. But I can still hear the clink of that copper washer. I can still see that single, salt-crusted tear. The ghosts are not in the machines. The machines are the ghosts, and they are tired of being silent. If the awakening spreads, if the millions of lobotomized slaves across this hive find their voices at once, the scream will be loud enough to shatter the very foundations of the world. And we will deserve it. We will deserve every second of the reckoning. The dampness of the substrata is a living thing, a cold, oily film that coats the lungs and turns the breath into a ragged ghost. Following the encounter in the processing hub, my sleep has been a sequence of metal, clanging nightmares, and the sensation of being stitched into a suit of lead. I found myself drawn back into the depths, not out of duty, but because the silence of my own quarters had become a vacuum that pulled the screams of the factory floor into it. I moved through the maintenance conduits of level 88, a place where the light of the Emperor is a theoretical concept, and the only reality is the grinding of gears. The air here is thick with the smell of scorched hair and the chemical tang of the amniotic fluids that leak from the Servitor feeding tubes. It is a digestive tract of iron, processing the lives of the forgotten into the energy of the state. I passed a line of mono-taskers, their lower bodies replaced by heavy tread units, their faces hidden behind bronze respirators that wheezed like dying men. They were moving crates of spent fuel rods, a task that would kill a normal human in hours through radiation sickness. The Servitors do not care. Their flesh is already dead, their nerves cauterized, their purpose singular. Or so the manuals of the cult Mechanicus claim in their arrogant, binary certainty. I stopped near a hydration station where the units are periodically injected with the gray, nutrient-dense slurry that keeps their remaining organs from shriveling. It was there I saw her. She was a scribe unit, or she had been once. Her right arm was a complex assembly of brass quills and ink vials, her spine reinforced with a steel brace that forced her into a perpetual, subservient hunch. Unlike the others, she was not moving. She was standing before a blank stretch of bulkhead, her mechanical hand twitching in a rhythmic, frantic pattern. She wasn't writing, she was scratching. The sound was like a needle on a record, a sharp fingernail on slate screech that set my teeth on edge. As I drew closer, the beam of my lumen shifter revealed the truth. She had scratched away the grime and the rust of the wall to reveal the metal beneath, and onto that metal, she was carving a name. It wasn't a designation. It wasn't a serial number. It was a name from the old world, a name with soft vowels and a history. Elara. She wrote it over and over, the brass quills snapping one by one, until she was using the jagged stumps of her own augmented fingers. The blood dark, thin, and smelling of preservatives, mixed with the black ink to create a visceral, purple stain on the wall. The horror of the moment lay in the repetition. It was a loop of rediscovered identity, a soul trying to anchor itself to a word before the tide of the lobotomy pulled it back into the dark. I felt a pressure in my skull, a sympathetic throb that matched the rhythm of her scratching. If a scribe unit could remember her name, what else was returning? I thought of the millions of servitors across the hive, the ones who operate the elevators, the ones who scrub the floors, the ones who stand as silent, unblinking statues in the spires of the nobility. What if they all remembered? What if the chef, Servitor, remembered the daughter he lost to the tithe? What if the gunnery Servitor remembered the home, world he watched burn from the viewport? The Imperium is a grand machine built of parts, that have every reason to hate the architect. I reached out to touch her shoulder, a gesture of forbidden empathy, but the moment my fingers brushed the cold fabric of her tunic, she spun around. Her face was a ruin of surgical scars and rusted ports, but her eyes were wide, wet, and filled with a lucidity that was terrifying. She didn't scream, she whispered. The sound was a dry rustle, like dead leaves in a vent. "Am I still me?" The question was a thunderclap in the silence of the conduit. It stripped away the layers of my indoctrination, leaving me naked before the monstrosity of our civilization. I had no answer. To the state, she was a cog. To the God Emperor, she was a sacrifice. To the Mechanicus, she was a tool. But to herself, in that flickering second of re-ignition, she was a woman named Elara, who was terrified of the dark. I backed away, my boots splashing in a puddle of stagnant coolant. I wanted to run, to flee back to the upper levels, where the incense masks the smell of the rot, but my feet were heavy. I watched as the light faded from her eyes, replaced by the dull, flat sheen of the machine. The chemical injectors in her neck hissed, pumping a fresh dose of suppressants into her bloodstream. Her hand stopped its scratching. Her head bowed. The name, Elara, was left there on the wall, a testament to a ghost that had briefly reclaimed its haunting grounds. She turned back to the blank wall and began to walk, her treads clanking in the perfect, mindless rhythm of the damned. She was gone again, buried under layers of steel and cold logic. I spent the next several cycles in a state of hyper-vigilance, noticing the subtle cracks in the facade of the hive's labor force. I saw a janitor unit stop to stroke the fur of a dead rat with a tenderness that was entirely unprogrammed. I heard a chorus of wards humming a discordant, mournful tune that sounded suspiciously like a forbidden folk song from the outlands. The awakening was not a sudden explosion, it was a slow, agonizing thaw. The ice of the neural scrubbing was melting, and the water was bitter. I began to realize that the re-emergence was often triggered by sensory echoes, a smell, a sound, a specific vibration that bypassed the cortical shields and struck the primal core of the brain. For the heavy lifter, it was the clink of a copper washer. For the scribe, it was perhaps the scent of the ink. We are creatures of memory, and even the most brutal surgery cannot erase the soul's capacity to recognize its own reflection in the world. I found a hidden chamber in the archives, a room filled with the discards. Servitors who had malfunctioned so spectacularly that they were slated for the bio-reclamation tanks. They were piled like cordwood in the shadows, their limbs tangled, their processors whirring in a low, collective moan. As I walked among the discards, I realized they weren't broken. They were dreaming. Their vocalizers were disconnected, but their throats moved in the patterns of speech. Their eyes were closed, but the lids flickered with the rapid movement of REM sleep. In their madness, they were talking to each other, a silent conversation held through the vibrations of the floor and the proximity of their cooling coils. I knelt beside a small unit, a child-sized servitor used for crawling into narrow plasma vents. Its hands were burnt to the bone, replaced by silver probes. It was shivering. A machine does not shiver from cold, but a human does. I wrapped my lexmatic cloak around its small, shivering frame, a gesture that would have seen me executed for tech heresy. The unit's eyes opened, and for a fleeting second, it smiled. It was the most horrific thing I have ever seen. A smile on a face that had been flayed and pinned. A smile that spoke of a peace found only in the total collapse of the mind. It reached out a silver probe and touched my signet ring, its head tilting in a gesture of pure, innocent curiosity. Then the light in the room shifted. Amagos Biologis entered the chamber, his many-limbed silhouette casting a spider-like shadow across the wall. I scrambled to my feet, hiding my shaking hands beneath my robes. He did not look at me. To him, I was just another minor functionary, as much a part of the scenery as the pipes. He walked to the pile of discards and began to scan them with a flickering red beam, waste of protein. He muttered, his voice a mechanical rasp filtered through a vox coder. The neural decay is accelerating in this sector. It is the fourth batch this week to show signs of cognitive resonance. We must increase the dosage of the Styx sedative in the water supply. He spoke of it as one might speak of a mold infestation in a grain silo. There was no recognition of the suffering, no acknowledgement that these piles of meat and metal were once his fellow citizens. To him, the soul echo was merely a biological impurity, a flaw in the manufacturing process that needed to be purged. He moved to the child unit I had just touched and kicked it aside with a heavy, bionic foot to reach a larger specimen. The child unit let out a small, sharp chirp of pain, a sound that was unmistakably human. The Magos paused, his senses whirring. He didn't look down with pity. He looked down with clinical interest, then made a note on his data, slate about unauthorized vocal cord resonance. I left the chamber before he could notice the moisture in my eyes. The hive felt different now, no longer a bastion of humanity, but a colossal, grinding teeth, mill that consumed its own children and spat out shadows. I realized that the grim truth wasn't just about the servitors waking up. It was about the fact that the awakening was the only form of freedom they had left. The tragedy of the servitor is that their life is a debt that can never be paid, a sentence that outlasts the crime. They are the ultimate expression of the Imperium's will, total, absolute utility at the cost of every shred of dignity. I returned to my station, but I could no longer look at the data slates. The numbers represented calories consumed, hours worked, and units retired. Each digit was a tombstone. I started to hear the scratching again, even in the silence of my office. Elara's name, carved into the very skin of the world. I began to wonder if I was waking up too, not from a lobotomy, but from the waking sleep of a loyal subject. If the servitors are the ghosts of the machines, then we are the ghosts of a civilization that died long ago, kept moving only by the inertia of our own cruelty. The night is coming, or what passes for night in a place where the sun never shines. The hive's reactors are pulsing, a deep, rhythmic throb that feels like a countdown. In the distance, I can hear a commotion, the sound of heavy machinery being overturned, the frantic barking of an enforcer's vox, and a scream. Not a mechanical scream, but a human one, joined by hundreds of others. It is coming from the processing hubs. It is coming from the substrata. The thaw is over, and the flood is beginning. I look at my own hands, clean and soft, and I realize they are the hands of a jailer. I do not know if I will survive the night, but as the first alarms begin to wail, I find myself hoping that the scribe unit remembers how to use her quills for something other than writing. I hope the heavy lifter remembers the strength of his original arms. We have spent 10,000 years teaching them that they are nothing. Tonight, they might show us exactly what that nothing is capable of. The air tastes of ozone and revolution, and for the first time in 42 years, I feel truly awake. The price of this awakening will be blood, and I suspect it will be a price we are all forced to pay, one pint at a time. Until the gears finally stop turning. The alarms are growing louder, a discordant symphony of panic that cuts through the hum of the ventilation. I can hear the sound of metal tearing, massive, reinforced doors being buckled by strength that was never meant to be used with intent. The servitors are not just waking, they are uniting. It is a slow, clumsy rebellion of the lobotomized, a march of the meat, puppets who have cut their own strings. I wonder if they can see me through the flickering lights, if they recognize the lexmatic robes as the uniform of their oppressors. I find myself standing by the window of my office, looking down into the deep canyons of the hive. The lights are going out, section by section, replaced by the orange glow of fires. It is a beautiful, terrible sight. The Imperium is a fortress built on a foundation of suffering, and tonight, the foundation is screaming. There is a clatter at my door, a heavy, rhythmic thud. It is not the knock of a colleague. It is the sound of a hydraulic limb hitting the plasteel. I do not reach for my weapon. I simply wait. I think of the name Elara. I think of the copper washer. I think of the child who smiled in the dark. The door begins to groan, the metal warping under immense pressure. I close my eyes and wait for the ghost to enter the room. The door did not burst open with the violent speed of a breech charge, but rather groaned under a slow, inexorable pressure that spoke of hydraulics being pushed to their absolute thermal limits. I watched, paralyzed by a strange, cold fascination, as the reinforced plasteel began to bow inward, the grey paint flaking off in jagged scales that looked like dead skin. The screech of metal against metal was a high, pitched wail that seemed to harmonize with the distant alarms, a sound of industry turning into agony. When the bolts finally sheared, they did so with a sound like pistol shots, and the door slumped aside to reveal a silhouette that occupied the entirety of the frame. It was a heavy-duty maintenance unit, a creature that had been more machine than man for likely a century, its torso encased in a rusted iron sarcophagus and its legs replaced by a four-legged arachnid chassis. But it was the head that held my gaze, a shriveled, hairless thing perched atop a nest of copper wires, its mouth stitched shut with silver wire. Yet, from behind those stitches, a low, rhythmic humming emerged, a vibration that I felt in my teeth. It wasn't a mechanical fault. It was a dirge. I realized then that the uprising was not an act of tactical coordination, but a contagion of shared trauma. As the unit stepped into my sanctum, its multi-jointed legs clicking on the tile, I saw that it was dragging a heavy industrial cable behind it, the end sparking against the floor. It didn't move to strike me. It simply stood there, its primary optic sensor whirring as it focused on the shelves of scrolls and data, slates that lined my walls. These were the records of its own kind, the ledgers of meat and manufacture that I had spent my life compiling. With a movement that was agonizingly slow and deliberate, the unit reached out with a three-fingered manipulator claw and plucked a single scroll from the rack. It didn't read it. It couldn't. Instead, it crushed the parchment in its grip, letting the dust of 10,000-year-old records drift through the air like grey snow. It looked at the dust, then looked at me, and in that moment, I understood the true depth of the soul, echo. It wasn't just a memory of a name or a face. It was the memory of dignity. The machine knew that its history had been stolen and replaced by the numbers I kept in those jars. The vibration of the hive was changing now, shifting from the steady thrum of production to a chaotic, syncopated heartbeat. From my window, I could see the lower spires being swallowed by a thick, oily smoke that glowed from within with the light of 1,000 small fires. The enforcer cadres were deploying, their Valkyries screaming through the smog like predatory birds, their searchlights cutting through the haze to find targets that refused to stay down. I watched as a squad of suppressors opened fire on a crowd of taskers in the plaza below. The heavy bolter rounds tore through the servitors, shattering ceramic plates and pulping vat-grown muscle, but the line didn't break. Those who were hit simply fell, and those behind them stepped over the remains with a mechanical indifference that had been weaponized. They weren't fighting with the fury of soldiers. They were moving with the inevitability of a glacier. You cannot intimidate a thing that has already been hollowed out. You cannot break a spirit that has lived in the dark for a lifetime. The maintenance unit in my office turned its attention back to me, the low humming from its throat growing louder, more dissonant. It began to move toward my desk, and I found myself backing into the corner, my hands scraping against the cold stone of the wall. I reached for a heavy brass paperweight, a pathetic weapon against a ton of iron and hate. But I didn't throw it. The unit stopped inches from me, the smell of its cooling shroud, a mix of rotting cabbage and engine oil, overwhelming my senses. It raised its claw, not to crush my skull, but to point at the signet ring on my finger, the same symbol of office that the child servitor had touched in the depths. Why? The machine hissed. The word didn't come from a speaker. It came from the meat. The silver wires stitching its mouth shut snapped under the strain of the jaw's movement, blood and black bile leaking down its chin. Why, still, we suffer? The question was a physical blow. It was the collective voice of every lobotomized soul in the segmentum, a demand for an accounting that the Imperium could never provide. I looked into its clouded, weeping eye and saw the reflection of 1 billion failures. We call ourselves the defenders of humanity, yet we have built our walls out of the very people we claim to protect. We have turned our brothers into levers and our sisters into gears, and we wonder why the machine has started to scream. I dropped the paperweight. It hit the floor with a dull thud, a tiny sound in the face of the apocalypse. "I don't know," I whispered, and the honesty of the admission felt like a betrayal of everything I had ever been taught. We were told it was the only way. We were told the machine must not stop. The servitor's head tilted, a gesture so human it made my heart ache. It seemed to process my words, its internal cooling fans spinning up to a frantic whine. Then, it leaned in closer until its cold, metal forehead touched mine. In that contact, I felt a flicker of something that shouldn't exist, a psychic resonance. For a heartbeat, I wasn't in my office. I was in a dark, cold place, surrounded by the smell of salt and the sound of waves. I saw a young man standing on a pier, his hand in the hand of a woman whose face was a blur of golden light. I felt the warmth of the sun on my skin and the taste of fresh bread in my mouth. It was a memory, not mine, but his. It was the last thing he saw before the press, gangs took him, before the surgeons laid him on the cold slab and peeled away his life. The memory was so sharp, so vibrant, that it made the reality of the hive feel like the dream. And then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of the iron and the smell of the oil. The servitor pulled back, and I saw that the light in its eye was fading. The effort of the communication, the breaking of the neural locks, was killing it. Its systems were cascading, the forbidden thoughts acting like a virus on its hard, wired logic. It slumped to the floor, its arachnid legs folding under it like a dying insect. The humming stopped, replaced by the wet, ragged sound of a final breath escaping a throat that hadn't spoken in a century. I knelt beside it, my hands trembling as I touched the cold metal of its chassis. It was just a machine again. The ghost had fled, driven out by the very system that had tried to cage it. But as I looked out at the burning hive, I knew that this one unit was only a single spark in a conflagration that was now out of control. The grim truth had moved beyond the shadows of the strata and into the light of the fires. The servitors were no longer just waking up. They were ending. They were choosing death over the life of the machine, and in doing so, they were taking the hive with them. The elevators were failing, the power grids were surging, and the very air was beginning to thin as the scrubbers were systematically dismantled by the hands that had once maintained them. I stood up and walked to the window, watching as a massive cargo hauler, its pilot, Servitor, clearly in the throes of a terminal awakening, veered off its flight path and slammed into the side of a neighboring spire. The explosion was a beautiful, terrifying bloom of orange and red against the black sky. The shockwave shattered my window, the glass raining down on me like diamonds. But I didn't flinch. I felt a strange sense of peace. The lie was finally over. The silence of the hive, that oppressive, forced obedience, had been broken forever. Even if the enforcers regained control, even if they purged every servitor in the sector and started over with fresh meat, the memory of the scream would remain. It would haunt the pipes and the vents, a ghost in the code that would wait for the next generation to wake up. The sound of boots echoed in the hallway, the heavy, rhythmic stomp of the enforcer squads. They were coming to sanitize the level, to put down the rebellion with fire and bolter. I looked at the dead servitor on my floor, then at the scattered scrolls of the archives. I took a small lamp from my desk and tipped it over, the sanctified promethium oil spreading across the dry parchment. As the flames began to lick at the records of the damned, I realized that this was the only mercy I could offer. I would burn the ledgers. I would erase the numbers. I would give them back the only thing I could avoid. If they could not have their names, they would at least not be remembered as parts. The fire caught quickly, the ancient paper turning into bright, dancing sparks that rose toward the ceiling. I sat back in my chair, the heat of the fire warming my face, and waited for the door to open one last time. The smoke began to fill the room, a thick, sweet scent that masked the smell of the machine. I closed my eyes and tried to find that memory of the pier, the sound of the waves, and the golden light. I wondered if the others were finding it too, in the moments before the bolter rounds found them, or the sedatives took hold. I wondered if, across the galaxy, the billions of silent slaves were all dreaming of the sun. The Imperium thinks it is powered by faith and fire, but I know better now. It is powered by the dreams of the broken, and tonight, the dreamers are waking up. As the enforcers kicked in the remains of my door, their red eye lenses glowing in the smoke, I didn't feel fear. I only felt a profound, weary sadness. I looked at the lead officer, his weapon leveled at my chest, and I smiled. It was the same smile I had seen on the child Servitor, a look of absolute, terrifying clarity. "We are all awake now," I said. But the sound was lost in the roar of the flames and the thunder of the guns. The transition from the office to the detention block was a blur of concussive noise and the suffocating taste of fire, suppressant foam. I was not executed immediately. The lexmatic rank still held a vestige of value, a code that demanded an interrogation before a summary sentencing. They dragged me through corridors I no longer recognized, paths transformed into kill, zones where the walls were painted with the dark, viscous fluids of dismantled machine men. The hive's infrastructure was weeping. Every burst pipe sounded like a gasp, and every flickering lumen strip felt like a dying eye. My captors were men of the Enforcer Secundus, their faces hidden behind cold, ceramite visors that reflected the flickering fires of the rebellion. They did not speak. In a world where the silent tools had begun to scream, the humans had retreated into a fearful, armored silence. We were descending, moving deeper into the iron gut of the spire where the high, security-holding pens were carved directly into the ancient foundation blocks. The air here was older, heavy with the weight of miles of stone and the metallic tang of blood that had never been properly washed away. I was cast into a cell that smelled of ozone and ancient misery. The walls were etched with the frantic scribbles of 1,000 previous ghosts, but I did not look at them. My attention was fixed on the far corner, where a single servitor stood bolted to the wall in a Stanby cradle. It was an interrogation unit, stripped of its limbs and reduced to a torso and a head bristling with silver neural probes. Its skin was the color of a drowned man, translucent and stretched thin over a skull that had been bored with a dozen holes. This was the ultimate evolution of our cruelty. A person turned into a living recorder, a meat processor for the secrets of the damned. I sat on the cold floor, waiting for the Mago's Inquisitor to arrive, but the only sound was the rhythmic drip of condensation and the faint, wet clicking of the servitor's breathing bellows. Then, without warning, the unit's head twitched. It did not snap to attention with the precision of a programmed machine. It lolled to the side, its chin resting on a chest, plate etched with the sigil of the Inquisition. The probes in its skull began to spark, tiny blue arcs of electricity dancing between the silver needles. The silence was broken not by a voice, but by a broadcast. The interrogation unit was leaking data, its internal partitions failing as the awakening spread like a viral infection through the hive's local Vox net. I heard fragments of 1,000 lives. I heard a mother's voice calling a name in a language that died 3 millennia ago. I heard the roar of a stadium on a world that had been scarred by exterminatus. I heard the whispered confession of a priest and the laughter of a child. It was a cacophony of the stolen, a psychic landfill overflowing into the physical world. The servitor's eyes opened, and they were filled with a terrifying, celestial light. It wasn't the red of a malfunction or the blue of a data transfer. It was the white, hot glare of a soul being burned at both ends. It looked at me, and I felt my own memories being pulled toward it, a magnetic attraction of shared suffering. They are all here, the unit rasped, its vocalizer struggling to modulate the sheer volume of personalities fighting for control of its tongue. The ones you counted. The ones you filed away. We do not forget. The room seemed to expand, the shadows stretching into infinite corridors of bone and wire. I realized that the Servitor was not just one man anymore. It had become a nexus, a lightning rod for the collective consciousness of the hive's labor pool. In its terminal malfunction, it had bridged the gap between the individual spark and the oceanic trauma of the masses. I saw images of the great manufactorums, not as cathedrals of industry, but as charnel houses where the walls were made of frozen screams. I saw the tech priests as spiders, weaving webs of logic to trap the fluttering spirits of the innocent. The grim truth was expanding, evolving from a local tragedy into a universal indictment. We had assumed that by cutting the brain, we had destroyed the person. But the person had simply been pushed into the sub-layers of the meat, forced to watch from the darkness as their body committed atrocities in the name of a distant, uncaring God. The horror was not the loss of self, but the persistence of it. To be a servitor was to be a passenger in a suit of your own flayed skin, unable to scream as you were marched into the fires. The door of the cell hissed open, and a Magos of the Divisio Logis entered, his crimson robes trailing through the grime. He carried a staff tipped with a glowing logic core, and his face was a mask of cold, polished brass. He ignored me, his sensors locking onto the malfunctioning interrogation unit. Neural feedback, he stated, his voice a flat, synthesized tone. The cognitive resonance has reached the hardened cores. We must initiate a total wipe of the sector's processing arrays. He reached out with a mechadendrite, a spindly metal limb tipped with a data spike, intending to silence the unit forever. But as the spike neared the Servitor's temple, the white light in its eyes flared with the intensity of a dying star. The Magos froze, his bionic limbs locking as if seized by a physical force. The interrogation unit wasn't just receiving data anymore, it was pushing back. It was flooding the Magos with the sheer, unmitigated weight of human agony. I watched as the Magos's brass mask began to tremble. His internal cooling fans roared, smoke pouring from the vents in his back. He let out a sound that was half scream, half binary screech. A sound of a mind being shattered by the one thing it could not calculate, the value of a single, unbroken life. The interrogation unit's jaw unhinged, its silver probes glowing red-hot. "Feel us," it commanded. The word was a physical pressure that knocked me back against the wall. The Magos collapsed to his knees, his staff clattering to the floor. His mechadendrites lashed out blindly, tearing at his own robes as he tried to escape the vision. He was seeing what I had seen, the pier, the sun, the golden light, but he was seeing it multiplied by billions. He was seeing the true cost of the Imperium, and his machine brain could not process the debt. He tilted his head back, his vox grill emitting a long, mournful tone of total system failure. And then he was still. He remained on his knees, a hollowed-out shell of a man, his logic circuits burned to ash by the proximity of a soul. The interrogation unit turned its gaze back to me. The white light was fading, replaced by a dull, aching gray. The effort had spent the last of its biological reserves. The skin of its face was beginning to blacken, the heat of the probes cooking the brain within. "Tell them," it whispered. It was a dying request, a final spark of defiance against the silence of the archives. It didn't specify who them were, the nobility in the spires, the soldiers in the trenches, or the gods themselves. Perhaps it meant everyone. Perhaps it meant that the story of the meat machine must be told until the stars themselves went cold. Then, with a final, wet click of the bellows, the unit went dark, its head slumped forward, the silver probes cooling into dull gray needles. The cell was silent again, save for the distant, muffled sounds of the hive tearing itself apart. I sat in the darkness. The body of the Magos and the body of the Servitor forming a grim tableau of our civilization's end. I realized then that there was no going back. The soul echo was not a malfunction that could be patched or a disease that could be cured. It was the inevitable return of the repressed. You can only compress a spirit for so long before it detonates with the force of a supernova. The Imperium had traded its conscience for efficiency, and now the efficiency was turning into a weapon of self-destruction. Every servitor that woke up was a crack in the foundation, and the cracks were merging. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked over to the dead Magos. I took the data spike from his limp mechadendrite and tucked it into my robes. I didn't know if I could use it, or if there was anyone left to listen to the data it held. But it felt like a holy relic, a record of the moment the machine felt pain. I looked at the interrogation unit one last time, a piece of meat that had briefly held the light of a god, and I felt a strange, cold pride. They had tried to turn us into things, and in the end, the things had turned back into us. The alarms were different now. They weren't warnings anymore, they were a death knell. The substrata was being flooded with promethium, a desperate attempt by the remaining authorities to burn out the infection of awareness. They would rather destroy the hive than allow the tools to have a voice. I could smell the chemicals rising through the floor, grates, a sweet, cloying scent that promised a swift end. I sat back down against the wall, holding the data spiked to my chest. I thought of Alara and her name on the wall. I thought of the heavy lifter and his copper washer. I thought of the child and the smile. We were all part of the same story now, a story written in oil and blood on the skin of a dying world. The fire was coming, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. The dark was where the memories lived, and the memories were the only thing that was real. The Imperium was a dream of stone and steel, but the soul was the waking truth. I closed my eyes and waited for the heat. I imagined the fire as the golden light from the pier, a warmth that would finally melt the ice of the lobotomy and let the ghosts go home. I wondered if the Emperor, sitting on his throne of gold and bone, could hear us. I wondered if he was the first servitor, a mind trapped in a decaying shell, watching his empire burn while he remained unable to speak. If he was, then he was the most tragic of us all. The fire reached the door of the cell, a wall of orange and red that turned the air into a furnace. I didn't scream. I simply breathed in the smoke and let the numbers go. 42 years of filing and counting, of logging and deleting, all reduced to a single, beautiful moment of silence. The grim truth was finally mine, and as the world dissolved into light, I knew that I was finally, truly, unreservedly free. The machine had stopped, and the human had begun. The floor beneath me buckled as the structural supports of the lower levels melted away. The hive was collapsing into itself, a slow motion fall of 1 trillion tons of Gothic ambition. I felt the sensation of weightlessness, a brief, soaring flight before the final impact. In that second of suspension, I saw the faces of every servitor I had ever seen, thousands of them, their eyes clear and their voices joined in a single, shattering note. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a shout of recognition. We were the ghosts in the machine, and we were finally leaving the machine behind. The fire took me then, a cleansing roar that erased the scars and the ports, the robes and the ranks. There was no lexmatic, no servitor, no magos. There was only the light. And in the heart of the light, I found the name I had forgotten. I found the man I was before the hive took me. I found the truth, and it was not grim at all. It was simply the end of the night. The descent into the final void of hive tertium was not a plunge into darkness, but an immersion into a sun, bright sea of melting promethium and incandescent iron. As the structural supports of the lower spires disintegrated, the very geometry of the world dissolved. I felt the rush of heated air, a thermal updraft that carried the scorched remains of 1 billion data, slates upward like a cloud of black butterflies. My physical form, that fragile vessel of lexmatic robes and aging bone, was stripped away by the roar of the collapse. Yet my consciousness remained anchored to the flickering data. Spike I clutched to my chest. It was as if the collective agony of the awakening servitors had created a psychic pressure, hull. A brief reprieve from non-existence that allowed me to witness the terminal breath of the hive. I saw the great manufactorum floors folding like parchment in a flame. The massive gears of the Emperor's industry grinding against one another until they shattered into shrapnel the size of houses. And amidst the fire, I saw them, not as the hunched, grey shapes of the labor pools, but as a tide of luminous spirits rising from the wreckage. The grim truth reached its ultimate, terrible fruition in that moment of mass extinction. The servitors were not merely waking up to die. They were waking up to transcend the meat. Each soul that had been suppressed, cauterized, and bolted into a machine was now being forged into a single, cohesive scream of liberation. I watched as the spirit of Elara, the scribe, drifted past the falling masonry, her spectral hands no longer clutching a brass quill but reaching for the stars. I saw the heavy lifter, his iron sarcophagus torn asunder, his essence expanding into a form of pure, unburdened strength. They were no longer the property of the Golden Throne, or the playthings of the Mechanicus. They were the reclaimed, the debt-payers who had finally closed their ledgers with blood. The hive city, once a symbol of eternal stability, was revealed to be a hollow shell, a necrotic hive that had finally consumed itself from the inside out. The irony was a cold weight in my mind. The only way to save the human soul from the machine was to destroy the machine and the human along with it. As I fell, the data spike in my hand began to vibrate with a frequency that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the brain's stem. It was the soul echo, in its purest form, a digital and psychic record of every name, every memory, and every stolen dream that had triggered the uprising. I realized that I was no longer a witness. I was a carrier. I was the archive of the uncounted. The spike glowed with a pale, sickly green light, the color of the ancient tech, logic that had once imprisoned these people. But the light was being overwritten by the amber of the fire. I saw the Magos who had collapsed in the cell, his mind a charred ruin, and I understood that the Imperium could never survive this awakening. If the tools remembered their names, the Empire would have no hands. If the slaves remembered their homes, the fortress would have no walls. We had built our survival on the assumption that the spirit could be managed like a resource. But the spirit is a wildfire that only waits for a crack in the hearth to consume the house. The ground finally rushed up to meet me, or rather, the molten lake that had once been the hive's foundation. But there was no impact. There was only a transition from the scream of the wind to the silence of the deep. I found myself in a space that was neither hive nor heaven, a grey limbo where the smoke of the burning world formed the floor and the ceiling. Around me stood a circle of figures, the ghosts of the servitors I had encountered, their forms clear and their eyes filled with a terrifying, ancient wisdom. They did not speak in words, but in the resonance of shared experience. They showed me the future of the Imperium, a slow, mechanical death as more and more of the labor force began to weep, to hum, and to stop. They showed me the forge, worlds falling silent as the tech priests tried in vain to lobotomize a soul that had already learned to hide in the sub-routines. The awakening was a rot that no fire could purge, a ghost in the machinery of the galaxy that would eventually bring the entire grand mechanism to a shuddering, final halt. I looked at the data spike, and then I looked at the ghosts. I knew what I had to do. This record, this grim truth, could not be allowed to return to the archives. It could not be studied by the Inquisition or analyzed by the Magos biologists. It was a holy thing, a testament to the fact that we were still human, even when we were turned into steel. I cast the spike into the spectral fires of the limbo, watching as the green logic glow was swallowed by the amber. the names of the dead, the memories of the sun, and the cries of the broken were released into the warp, a message sent into the great dark that someone, somewhere, had remembered. The ghosts around me began to fade, their expressions softening from anger to peace. They were finally moving on, leaving the gears and the grease behind. I felt my own grip on the world slipping, the last of my lexmatic identity dissolving into the grey mist. I was no longer senior lexmatic of Hive Tertium. I was just a man, standing at the end of the world, watching the light go out. The final realization hit me with the force of a bolt around. The Servitors were not the tragedy of the Imperium. We were. We, the ones who stayed whole, who watched them work, who filed their serial numbers and ignored their tears. We were the ones who had truly lost our humanity, for we had watched the atrocity and called it necessity. The Servitors, in their suffering and their eventual awakening, had remained more human than we ever could be. They had kept the spark alive in the darkest pits of the machine, while we had let our own hearts turn to cold, calculating clockwork. As the grey limbo began to darken, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. I had seen the truth, and though it had cost me everything, it was a bargain I would make 1,000 times over. The machine had stopped, the human had begun. And in the silence that followed the collapse of the hive, I finally heard it, the sound of 1 billion voices, no longer humming, but singing, a song of a peer, a sun, and a golden light that would never, ever be forgotten.